I believe we can start. Welcome everyone to this webinar. I'm very happy to welcome today Eviane Leidig, who will be presenting and discussing with me and everyone her new book on the women of the far right. I'm very excited to have Eviane here. I'm reading the book myself, indeed in a topic that is very interesting and very dear to my heart. Before I introduce Eviane, I need to make some ASEN announcements. For those who don't know me, my name is Daphne. And on behalf of ASEN, I'm told to tell everyone that the applications are open for the 2024 Anthony Smith Visiting Fellowship. This offers £5,000 for a 2-month stay at LSE Ideas, and you can find more information online in the ASEN webpage. So please take a look if you're interested. I'm also asked to let you know that applications are open for the 2024 ASEN Summer School at Zadar. I was part of this last year, a very exciting summer school. So I do encourage everyone to become involved. Again, you can find information on our website at asen.ac.uk/summer school. With all that out of the way, I am now very glad to again welcome Eviane Leidig. Eviane is, I'm sorry, I hope I pronounced this correctly. I always have difficulties with people pronouncing my name. Eviane is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at Tilburg University. She's also affiliated with the Center for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo, the Global Network on Extremism and Technology in London, and the International Center for Counterterrorism in The Hague. She's very frequently appears in the media, Independent, Al Jazeera, BBC, Australia Broadcasting are but few examples. And she has written this fascinating book on the women of the far right. I am going to let Eviane talk more about the book herself. I believe it's right there behind her. Perhaps you can show people in a minute. But just to say very quickly, the format now of this webinar is going to be a discussion format. So I'm going to commence with asking Eviane a few questions about the book, and then we're hoping to get everyone into the discussion so we can have more Q&A. Questions need to be sent to me, so feel free to direct them to the Zoom chat or also the Facebook and YouTube, and these will be sent to me. We should aim for about an hour, but we do have a couple of minutes of flexibility in case we need longer. So sorry for the very long introduction. And without further ado, Eviane Leidig, I'd like to start off with a question about, just broadly speaking, what gave rise to the book? What made you write this book?
Well, thanks a lot, Daphne, for that introduction, and also to ASEN for hosting and for organizing this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here. And I have been part of ASEN for several years now and attending some of the conferences. I think it was one of the first few academic conferences that I did attend. So it's such a pleasure to be here. Now, in terms of sort of what gave rise to the book, and as you can see, yes, it is behind me there on the bookshelf. There are really three main factors that motivated me to want to write this book. So the first starts off in 2019 when I started writing this book. And that was at the time of the dwindling of the so-called alt-right movement at that time. And in 2019, I remember thinking how over the past few years, there was so much media and public attention around the so-called alt-right and scholarly attention as well, in terms of people trying to understand what this movement was. But over the course of those few years, a lot of that attention was focused on the men within the alt-right, the most public, visible faces. And I knew that there were women who were quite active within this movement, but they were just not being talked about as seriously or taken as seriously, being called things like a Nazi Barbie and sort of undermining their role within the movement. So I wanted to understand what were their roles within the far right, and in essence, to almost sort of debunk stereotypes that people had about the far right at that time. The second reason which motivated me to want to write this book is related to the first. And that is while these women within the alt-right were like their male counterparts, discussing political commentary on YouTube or providing hot takes on current events, these same women were also posting a lot more, say, behind the scenes content on their Instagram page. You know, they were posting selfies behind rallies and demonstrations, posting, you know, them editing videos that were going to be released on their channels. And that really struck me in terms of why were these women trying to perform a much more holistic image of themselves compared to their male counterparts, which led me to the main argument of the book, which we can get to later. And then finally, the third motivation is, to my knowledge, it had been about 20 years since there had been an academic book focusing specifically on women within the far right, at least in a monograph style. There's been, of course, journal articles, edited volumes of different country case studies, but not a whole monograph that was really focused on the lives and sort of the backgrounds of women within the far right. And that was Kathleen Blee's book in 2022. I'm sorry, 2002. So I just sort of thought to myself, there needs to be an update for today in terms of what are the similarities and differences that women play within this movement compared to the past.
Very, very interesting. It's fascinating, actually, precisely because, you know, we do associate the far right with young, angry white men, sort of violent, but not quite women. And indeed, it's fascinating. Why I'm looking forward to hearing the argument. But before that, can you tell me a little bit more about your theoretical framework and what kind of literature you've used in the book?
Absolutely. So I would say that there's really two main bodies of literature that I am responding to within this book. The first is, predictably, I'm looking at studies of the far right, and also sort of the role within of gender within the far right. And within the far right, that is a focus on both ideology as well as organizations. And so ideology, I actually draw upon Cass Muda's work on the far right, which is a very political science-oriented perspective, I believe, in which he characterizes far right ideology as nativism, extreme nationalism, and authoritarianism. And we can have a whole debate about those different principles. And then in terms of far right organizations, you know, that's that really broad spectrum ranging from political parties to social movements to subcultures, online and offline, essentially the various ways that the far right sort of manifests its forms of mobilization and activism. So I'm speaking to that literature, but also, of course, looking at the role of gender within that. And interestingly, a lot of the work that has looked at gender in the far right has very much focused on constructions of masculinity. And actually very few studies looking at constructions of femininities. That's hence, you know, why I saw this gap within the literature. And then the second body of literature is actually drawing upon work that's being done in media and communication studies, and I think that hints to the title of the book, Online Radicalization, in which I look at the work that was being done on influencer culture within media and communication studies. And I will say that most of that work is very much focused more on the type of like marketing or corporate relations that influencers have with, say, companies. But very few have picked up on the fact that influencers can also have ideological or political sort of convictions in terms of what they are selling. So I sort of tried then to understand how the women of the far right that I profile in the book were drawing upon those influencer practices to get their messaging across. So it's really those two bodies of literature that I primarily focus upon in my theoretical framework in terms of those who've looked at the far right from different disciplinary focuses, and then from media and communication studies on influencers.
I have so many questions now. But why don't you tell us a little bit then more about the argument of the book before I delve into some more details that I'm very keen to hear about?
Yes, this is probably the core of our discussion right here. So the core argument of the book is I argue that the propaganda and marketing that is produced by far-right women plays a key function within the broader movement. And namely, that is their role in normalizing and legitimizing far-right ideology for mainstream appeal. So to break it down a bit more, as I mentioned, these far-right women that I've profiled, they engage in certain types of influencer practices on social media platforms. And I focus on YouTube and Instagram in the book. And I actually link how they use these influencer practices as an effective radicalization strategy. So a lot of the far-right women that I detail in the book, they are particularly adept at showcasing certain qualities of seeming to be relatable, accessible, and authentic to their followers and to mainstream audiences. And I show how this is a strategy that presents an opportunity for far-right actors to deliver propaganda on social media for a legitimizing effect of their political ideology. And I think this is something that is quite different from their male counterparts. For example, because their male counterparts tend to be a lot more escalatory in their rhetoric, a lot more violent in their rhetoric, and hence that's why we often see them get banned from platforms quite often. But for these women within the far right, they're very good at traversing that boundary between what is considered to be acceptable speech on these platforms. And that's often because they will cloak it in this acceptable discourse for their followers.
So what motivates these women? Did you have you looked at all into why paradoxically, and or is it paradoxically that they behave, that they do this?
I think it can break down into so many different reasons, and of course it depends on the individual. So when I was doing this research, I looked into the stories that these women would share about their radicalization journeys. And I do believe that for many of them, if not most of them, it was very genuine convictions that they had in terms of the ideological beliefs of the far right. But I also started to see them gain a lot more celebrity and attention, particularly within a movement which continuously is dominated by men, but often needs women to sort of showcase that this is a more legitimate space, or at least provide that perception of a more legitimate space. And so, at least with the influencers I studied, I think they are opportunists, and then they very much do see that there is a platform for them in this space. And they often will justify their own positioning through these terms of agency and empowerment, because they will claim, for example, that motherhood within the far right is empowering, that it provides women a sense of purpose and fulfillment. But for these influencers, of course, there is this aspect of celebrity that is attached to that I think that they very much desire, because some of these women I profiled, they actually left the far right and then came back. And then even some left again and came back. So I think there's a certain draw of being what is very much a sort of de facto leadership within this space.
That's very interesting. I'm abusing my position here until we get any questions. I'm continuing to ask. So before I have a sort of theoretical question for you, but actually before that, now that our conversation is getting very interesting, did you find any variation? So you said some of them left, some of them stayed. I just want to know more about who they are. Was there some variation? The ones that was it? You said they're opportunists. Do they have some kind of more standard profile in terms of their age or sociodemographic, or the ones that left and didn't come back? Did they have a specific reason for that?
That's a great question. And as somebody trained as a sociologist, I immediately thought about these various sociodemographic characteristics. So when these women detail their life stories and they go into their backgrounds, they will often talk about The fact that many of them grew up in middle-class families, in middle-class neighborhoods. They almost all of them had attended university, and some even went on to pursue postgraduate education. They also will describe entering into corporate jobs after graduating from university, and socializing with friends and colleagues from their jobs, living in urban areas. But then there's a moment in time in which these influencers describe feeling deeply unhappy and depressed with their life situations. And it's this sort of twist in their lives that they attribute to an anti-feminist message. So they believe that feminism controls mainstream society and forces women into, quote, unnatural roles in the workplace. So for these far-right women, they then argue that traditionalism is the antidote to feminism. So that if women are in charge of the domestic sphere and men are the primary breadwinners for their families, this will create harmony between the genders. Now, when it does come to things like radicalization stories, we should also take this with a grain of salt, because people's memories can be complex, sometimes contradictory. As Kathleen Blee, who's written about this, has noted, we tend to see our past selves through our present selves, meaning that we tend to sort of understand our past selves through our current worldview. So that's why I say we should take this with a grain of salt. But indeed, what was quite striking to me in terms of the profile of these women is that they were well educated, they were very articulate, and I think this is at least a spectrum of the far right that tends to not be noticed as frequently in terms of from the boots to blazers kind of image, in terms of people with university degrees, who read philosophy, who understand things like media strategy, and how they are able to really articulate quite extreme right ideas in ways that are palatable to mainstream audiences. But indeed, when I talk to people and I say I study middle class, university educated women, there is this sort of it definitely affects people's perceptions then of what the far right looks like.
Wow, indeed, fascinating. It does take me to some of my own work on generally the voters. And again, you see a lot of variations. So you do see some of the less educated, angry white men, but you also see in the broader voting patterns as well, this phenomenon. So it's very interesting. Mm-hmm. We're starting to have some questions, but I want to abuse my position and ask one more theoretical one. So I noticed, I've started reading the book. I haven't read it all, but I noticed you mention a theory of femonationalism. And while I actually have lots of students who are fascinated by the theory of femonationalism, and sort of we've discussed quite a lot this idea that especially in Europe, what you're seeing is this sort of spin of the far right along feminist lines. So basically to, the Islamophobic narrative, right? So to exclude on this basis of civic identity and say that certain particular groups are against feminists and against women's rights, etc. So I wanted to ask both in terms of theory, but also in terms of the empirical analysis that you have done. How much do you see this playing out in your book and generally in your study of these women?
I'm so glad that you brought up the concept of femonationalism, because I do touch upon that in the book, as well as a conversation on homonationalism to some extent. And I actually was trying to assess to what extent does this femonationalist rhetoric actually play into the narratives that are being produced by the far-right women that I studied. But I would say that it's certainly more the case in Europe than it is in North America. Particularly in North America, there tends to just be a much more conservative understanding of gender roles, and the alignment with feminist discourse, some feminist discourse, I should say, that is promoted by femonationalists, is a lot more strategic within the European context, particularly when it comes to far-right politics that is much more deeply embedded in political parties and social movements with connections to political parties than it is in the US. But indeed, I was quite curious to see like how much did femonationalism actually play in terms of these women's rhetoric. And it is very little. I mean, I would say that what was interesting is one influencer that I profiled attended this feminist demonstration in the UK, and she was going around and asking these women, feminism or Islam, basically women's rights or Islam was actually what she had asked them. And almost all the women, except for one, had all said, like, you're being ridiculous. It's not an either or question. So there's certainly this understanding amongst, I think, most of the feminists that she interviewed that, this is this is a false equivalency, with the exception of that one person, right? So I think when it comes to understanding then the theoretical grounding of femonationalism amongst far-right women and how they see the aspects of gender within the movement, it's something that is strategically deployed at certain contextual conditions, perhaps more so than others.
Very interesting. I'm sorry, my voice is leaving me. Struggling from a cold. We're starting to have quite a few questions, so I'm going to get to some of them. Let's start with Rachel. Question from Rachel. The far right is traditionally misogynistic. How do men in the far right respond to women in the far right?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So indeed, there is this paradox here in the fact that these far right women have very public platforms. And I don't want to gloss over I don't want to portray the idea that these women are universally accepted by all far right supporters. I mean, I would definitely see, while yes, they were promoting misogyny and patriarchal views in their rhetoric, they were at the same time receiving a lot of backlash from other men within the far right, particularly users or people commenting on their videos. And they would oftentimes they sort of disregard these comments, try to emasculate, men writing these misogynistic comments for them, saying if you say stuff like that in the chat, we're going to kick you off the live chat. So these sorts of things. And if you go to some of the forums, you can see how some male users write about these women in very sexist and degrading terms. So I definitely don't want to gloss over the idea that they are universally accepted within the movement. But on the other hand, there is this general understanding that these women are also sort of necessary to the movement. So when I was doing my research for the book, I had interviewed this young man who had been radicalized watching YouTube videos and was in the process of de-radicalizing. And he said something to me that really stuck, which was that a movement without women is doomed to fail. And I think that still resonates in terms of how I understand the positioning of these women, because they will, despite a lot of these misogynistic comments, they will say, well, who else will stand up as women within this movement if not for us? So they do a lot of self-rationalizing in terms of their own positioning and what they see as something of value to the movement. Again, that perhaps goes back to earlier comments about them being opportunists in this space as well, and sort of seizing that chance to be these spokespersons in a way.
Wow, thank you. The questions are really coming in now. So moving on to a question from Anders. Do particular platforms or changes in the policies of particular platforms affect how far-right influencers and far-right women influencers in particular communicate?
Oh, that's a great question. So I mentioned earlier that I primarily focused on YouTube and Instagram for this book. And in part, I wanted to focus on mainstream social media platforms, so not some of these more fringe or alt tech platforms. But also I focused on these two because they're highly visual. And I wanted to understand how these women were capturing a type of social media performance through visual orientation. And so I write about this in the book as capturing this type of online attention economy and how they're very good at seizing upon visibility and exposure that they sort of play off of these platforms. But with the question in terms of do particular platforms or changes in the policies of platforms affect these women? I mean, it's interesting because for many of these far-right women, for years, they have been saying, I'm going to be banned from this platform any day now, or follow me on this fringe platform instead. And yet, it's been 8 years and they have even more followers and they haven't suffered the repercussions of the content that they're producing. So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the men within the far right, they have faced repercussions like being banned or being deplatformed because the men of the far right are much more explicit in their rhetoric. They will say violent things or they'll incite violence, or they definitely violate what is seen as the community standards for a lot of platforms. But for women in the far right, they are able to sort of traverse that boundary in terms of what then gets accepted. So a lot of what they say doesn't technically violate the community standards of a platform. And they're very good at maneuvering that space. But I will say that they definitely use these platforms in different ways, which I think is getting to the question. On YouTube, they are primarily there to talk about political commentary and to offer hot takes on current events. Sort of reaction videos. But on Instagram, they are posting things like stories about the dinner that they're making that night for their family or gardening with their kids. So I've also noticed that on these different platforms, they tend to attract different audiences. So for example, on YouTube, I noticed that they have a disproportionate number of male viewers. Indeed, one of them had said that 85% of her viewers were male when she was looking at her YouTube analytics, which is very, very high. And I think when I started off with this research, I had assumed that most of these far-right women would be sort of attempting to radicalize other women into the movement. But at least on YouTube, it seemed like they were tended to radicalize more men into the far right. So that was an unexpected finding. But on Instagram, because they're posting about cooking dinner or gardening, they tend to have a lot more female followers on that platform. People who care about things like motherhood content or cooking and things like that. And so they use both of those platforms, but just in very different ways, I think, to solicit different types of audiences.
Fantastic. Let's move on to a question from Marius. How did you access these networks and how did you manage your positionality throughout the research?
Thanks for that question. So I did create fake profiles on my Instagram and YouTube. I don't think I could have managed to use my own personal profile for all this data collection. It would have just messed up my algorithm so much. But so I did create fake profiles. I employed a digital ethnographic approach. So I spent 3 years, actually, I would say even now that the book has been published, I'm still kind of keeping track of these women. Spent years following them, watching countless, almost all their YouTube videos on repeat and monitoring their Instagram profiles. And as I started doing this research, also noticing how they were using Instagram story, which, as we know, it disappears after 24 hours. So I was constantly on my phone getting alerted about the new stories that they were posting. And I think dealing with data collection in this way, which can be quite peripheral, which can disappear, it means that we're constantly on top of that material. So I kind of wrote about my experience, like constantly monitoring the content that was being produced by these women. I did not contact them directly. And this was something that was actually written into my ethics application, which was the very high risks that would be posed to myself. So as in the safety and security risks being placed on myself if I was to contact these women. Very likely I would be blocked, denied access, probably harassed and doxxed online. and not just from them, but from their followers as well. So I sort of made that argument in my ethics application for the project. And in terms of my own positionality, I think that's such a great question, because I wrote this book during the pandemic and I was alone. I was isolated. All I was doing was watching these YouTube videos every day. I do not recommend writing a book during a pandemic. It's not, you have a lot of time, but it's easy to sort of get sucked into that rabbit hole. And I think my idea that these women could be seen as quite relatable figures is partly steeped from my own positionality, because these were the type of women that I could have easily grown up with and gone to university with. And I saw a lot of demographic similarities between us. And so I think what was interesting was, over the time that I was following these women, they were experiencing different life events, as I was too. So that sort of made that a much more relatable connection. So I do write in the book a bit about my own sort of reflections and thoughts in terms of researching these women, and also kind of stopping myself at times, because even though I can understand the signs of radicalization, even myself, being immersed into their world, meant that I kind of had to take a step back sometimes. So I really like that question, because when we talk about movements like the far right, we tend not to assume that these people are like us, even though they can be.
Indeed. So let me move on to a question from Sam now. Can't think of any far-right female social media influencers in the UK or street level, recent cenotaph, anti-Palestinian demo world, Tommy Robinson football hooligan types. However, there are what add class as far-right women in the mainstream media. Suella Braverman, for example. Would you include them, or are you exclusively concerned with the explicitly fascist right?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, I did not study, for example, women in the mainstream space within the UK, because I was very interested in those individuals who had rose their sort of cemented their political activism as being these online personalities and sort of garnering audiences through that means, rather than, say, people more engaged in sort of mainstream politics or people concerned with gains at the ballot box, right? My arguments for this book is those who engage in a particular type of metapolitical activism. So these are people who want to change social and cultural norms in mainstream society by focusing on those aspects of livelihood. But within the book, at least for influencers in the UK, I actually primarily focused on so-called Tradwives. This is those who identify as traditional wives, which is an online community that emerged, I'd say, around 2015 and has gained a lot of popularity recently, particularly since the pandemic. And these are women who believe in instilling traditional gender roles of women and men, where the woman is the homemaker and tends to the household, and the husband is the provider and protector of the family who earns the income for the household. And Tradwives often will post content about, what a day in my life is like, everything from cleaning, cooking, raising the children, etc. And Tradwives, I argue, not all Tradwives are part of the far right, but all far-right women believe in trad values. And there are some figures from the Tradwife community who actually have traversed into the far right, have become much more extreme in their political views. The overlap the other way, it tends to be more how certain far-right actors take gender and racial norms of the trad community and amplify that for their political message. So in terms of the question about the UK context, I primarily look at popular Tradwives within the UK, and sort of show how then they do overlap with the far right when it comes to modeling what they see as sort of the ideal nuclear family unit structure and how that is a presupposed model for society.
Very interesting. Let's move again. I have so many. I'm trying to be fair to the people who asked them. Let me go to Benedetta's question then. Very interesting topic. Wanted to ask your opinion. I read an article published by EUI about how the only powerful women in the political field are always far-right women, reproducing and supporting the patriarchal society. What do you think about this? Do you think there is space for women in politics outside the far right, from what you saw in your study? And do you think that women in politics are aware of the fact that to be powerful, they have to somehow support patriarchy?
That's a very interesting question. I would like to read this article so that way I could perhaps be better informed as to its arguments. But certainly we have seen, I think maybe claiming that the only powerful women in the political field are always far right might be a bit of a step over, although I would like to see this article for reference. I mean, it's an interesting question because when we actually think about women's political participation, we tend to think about it in terms of them being involved in left-wing progressive movements. For instance, that gave rise to women's rights, feminism, LGBTQ rights, etc. Right? We think about the legacies of those movements. And so when it comes then to women in the far right or even conservative movements, I mean, there actually is a very strong legacy there, a strong history. But we tend, for some reason, to think not so much about their participation in these political spaces. So, yeah, I think that the claim here that is being made based on that article, I'd really have to take a look at it myself to understand. But I'm a bit skeptical of that, although I can see how that lends itself towards success. And certainly because oftentimes far right and or conservative spaces are so male dominated, there is certainly this platforming of women who can fit within that mold, and it definitely lends an image of success and often an image of legitimacy, because again, I think there is this mainstream assumption about, if a woman is present in these spaces, it somehow softens it or adds this aura of normalcy. Again, this might just be a more mainstream sort of sexist opinion about women in being involved in politics to begin with.
Absolutely. And I'm actually thinking of this question, right? Myself trying to see patterns. Indeed, I guess we can see strong women from across the political spectrum, right? So ranging from Scandinavia, where you see a lot of, left-wing women in strong positions, but also in other countries you see far right. So yeah, it's interesting that it would go across the board, really. Okay, let's move on to another question now about specifically looking at women in the Dutch far right. Have you done any research on that? And what is your take on the situation in the Netherlands, especially given the recent election results? Very topical.
Yes, very much so. So there is one woman of the far right in the Netherlands that I do look at. And then she wasn't part of the sort of original sample of women that I was exploring, although I noticed that she was becoming increasingly more popular. Not just within the Netherlands, actually, but because she is somebody who is, in my opinion, very well educated and very articulate, and she speaks several languages. So I saw her making appearances in media and giving speeches in German, Dutch, French, Spanish. I mean, she's become an extremely popular figure for different political parties across Europe, but also in the US. She's starting to foment ties with conservative activist groups there as well. So she's often traveling to attend conferences and give speeches in these different forums. So I do focus, yes, on at least one woman. And actually, part of me now, looking back at the book, I wish I had written more about her. because she has become such a popular figure. She now has more Instagram followers than any of the other women that I had studied in the book. And I'd say that her activism really started in 2020, whereas some of the other women I profile, they really started in 2015, 2016. So it's been interesting to see sort of new faces emerge within the scene. But I think she's also a really great example of how the far right can operate at such a transnational level as well, because she does promote a lot of, Dutch-specific issues for an international audience, for them to sort of understand what the situation looks like in the Netherlands, or rather how she constructs, whether or not that's the reality, we can debate that. And through her, I've started to see her engage with several of the far-right women I look at in North America, for example. So they will travel and meet each other, take selfies at different demonstrations. And so through this lens, I was able to capture what I argue is this type of transnational sisterhood that these far-right women are showcasing to their audiences. And they say to particularly to young women, if you join our movement, you can find like-minded women like ourselves, and we are happening at a transnational level. And so that is something that I think has been building over the past few years, but it becomes very idealized through figures like this influencer that I studied. And my take on the situation in the Netherlands, especially given the recent election results, well, I will say this influencer has been thrilled in terms of a lot of the activism that she's engaged in has become spotlighted here in the Netherlands. It's just very briefly, I'm not the foremost expert on Dutch politics, although I will say that for many people, it definitely was a surprise, but perhaps for those of us scholars, not entirely unexpected, sort of giving the shift towards the mainstreaming of the far right that we've seen elsewhere. I think we'll just have to wait to see what happens in terms of the formation of the cabinet. And I think there is certainly some pushback against Wilders being at the forefront of that. So I think there is some resiliency that is built into the system, which I'm hopeful about. But we'll see.
Can I just follow up quickly on this? So this Dutch woman that you follow, did you find her to be the same traditional woman profile, or given that the Netherlands, the far right in the Netherlands is quite different, isn't it? It's very pro LGBTQ and very sort of, gender progressive, if you like. Did you find her to be different than the others?
That's a really great question. And I think even though you lay out what are some very good differences here, in terms of, indeed, the Dutch far right have long been homonationalist, for example, this influencer was definitely much more conservative in her views. And I think what is happening in the Dutch far right, and maybe others might disagree, is I think there is a particular Americanization that is happening amongst the Dutch far right. So they very much have adopted certain terms like wokeness or critical race theory, culture wars. Like I actually see this being part of sort of the daily parlance of the Dutch far right. And they have been very inspired by some of the activism that is unfolding in the US. And so it also might be that this influencer in particular that I studied, she also has traveled extensively to the US and she does produce a lot of content in English. And so maybe she understands that those who are consuming English content, they tend to be from North America, although it definitely becomes a sort of universalizing language for a lot of the far right, even within Europe. So it's a really great question, Daphne. Although, yeah, even bearing in mind what you said is sort of about this Dutch culture of tolerance, it's I think there's a growing reactionary backlash against that amongst the far right in the Netherlands.
Interesting indeed. I would have expected something else. So that does say a lot, right? About all the variations that we see. Okay, what about a question from Jilly? Curious as to why you think there is so little attention to women in the far right within academic writing.
Oh, that's a it's a simple but actually a really insightful question here. At least I'm trying to remember some of the work that Kathleen Blee has done looking at gender more broadly within literature on the far right. And indeed, it's Kathleen Blee's work in which she mentions that there's been so much focus looking at masculinity in the far right, not enough on women. I suspect part of it also just might be how male dominant the space is. And so that definitely influences things like access and I mean, I think it's particularly if you were going to go about this in, say, more an ethnographic way, from what I understand of other female researchers like myself who study the far right, it's much easier for them to actually get face-to-face interviews with men than it is with women, actually. And I think part of that has to do with how women see their own positioning, how they tend to not want to engage externally, and how they sort of see that dominance of hierarchy within the movement that influences then their outlook. But on the other hand, Daphne, you might know this, there's also been a lot of increasing research looking at the role of female politicians amongst far-right political parties. So perhaps in that respect, there actually is quite a lot of literature at that. But I think you know better than me, Daphne, on that particular angle.
I agree with what you said. I think indeed. What about, okay, question from David. Is the cottagecore aesthetic deliberately used to detoxify far-right views, or is it accidental?
So for those of you who are unfamiliar, cottagecore is a particular aesthetic that sort of invokes this idea of like living life on the prairie, living sort of homesteading off the grid, being self-sufficient. And it's a particular aesthetic that I touch upon a bit within the book because, you know, some of these influencers, you know, while some of them might like that sort of 1950s housewife aesthetic, others like the sort of cottagecore bohemian aesthetic where they're sort of making their own sourdough bread and pickling and fermenting vegetables and things like that. I think part of it is certainly strategic when it comes to legitimizing a lot of far-right views in terms of making that a lot more palatable for audiences. Part of it could also just be personal preferences and tastes, because one influencer I know who embodies a lot of these cottagecore aesthetics, she's long been sort of drawn to that aesthetic. She mentioned herself in her background that growing up, she saw herself as a secular feminist, and then she enjoyed a lot of these sort of cottagecore-like qualities. And when she turned to the far right, you know, it's not like that part of her personality was just lost or disappeared. She sort of, I think this is another conversation in terms of people who do radicalize perhaps to far right views. They take their past with them, you know, they take their preferences and aesthetics and tastes with them. It's not something that completely gets lost. So I do think part of it is strategic. Part of it is personal preference, but also, you know, one argument in the book I have is that I think for many people, particularly these influencers in the far right, they often will use certain aesthetics as a means of retention, as a means of sort of, on their YouTube videos, they talk about things like politics or very extreme rhetoric. And then on their Instagram page, they're posting about sourdough starters. And so I argue that this is a much more holistic way of trying to present themselves and be able to retain interest from their audiences rather than only just talking about politics, for example, on YouTube. But yeah, maybe for more on cottagecore, there's kind of some, I detail some of that in the book, but I like that question. Thanks for that.
It's a very interesting word. I learned something new today. I admit cottagecore wasn't something I was familiar with, but I'll use it now from now on quite a lot. It's a very interesting word. Okay, what about any connection that you may have observed between those far-right women and conspiracy milieu?
Oh, absolutely, yes. So what conspiracies do not proliferate amongst the far right? I mean, certainly from the heydays of when these women began their political activism, a lot of conspiracies that would ferment into concepts like white genocide that would lead into like the Great Replacement conspiracy theory that was trending for several years. During the pandemic, there was also a shift towards other conspiracy theories like the Great Reset, which is this idea that, well, the Great Reset is actually a term developed by the the World Economic Forum, to imagine what society would look like after the pandemic and facing things like climate crises and migration crises. And so the World Economic Forum came up with this plan for different countries on how to sort of enact various steps to help manage that. Well, during the pandemic, the far right saw this document released and weaponized that into a conspiracy theory, saying, "Well, actually, this is an attempt towards governments trying to control populations biopolitically through things like vaccines, mask mandates, lockdowns, etc. This is all a plot to sort of control populations, and that vaccines were injected with things to affect people's fertility and virility, etc. So certainly the far right weaponized a lot of these conspiracies related to the Great Reset and similar ones around the vaccination, to then continue to promote its messaging about how this was all like a plan to control populations because these governments then want to encourage their doors open to migration. So they were kind of twisting a lot of these conspiracies and merging that with their previous ideological views around migration, around gender roles, etc. Some of these women also dabbled a little bit into things like QAnon conspiracies as well. But I like this question because it shows how, for many of these far-right women influencers, they were often kind of like tapping into different topics to sort of see if they can gain relevancy to different audiences. Now, the reality is that for many influencers, people tend to get bored, and so they kind of move on to the next influencer. So for these far-right women, they were trying to find new ways to stay engaged with their followers, perhaps even get new followers, by tapping into some of these things like conspiracy theories or maybe other types of topics, trying them out to see if does this work for my audience, and do I sort of continue to gain attention and visibility for these topics. So that was interesting to see over the years that I was researching these women, is how they were kind of evolving their rhetoric into these different avenues.
Fascinating. Moving on to a question from Gianni now. Do these influencers respond to national news stories, and how do they respond to what their audience wants in terms of content?
So the first question about do these influencers respond to national news stories? Absolutely, they do. Particularly on YouTube, where they're making a lot of reaction videos to things like current events, or some of these influencers are a lot more prominent in far-right and conservative media outlets, so they'll often go on to those media channels and offer their opinions and commentary to news stories. But also what I had said earlier about the transnational ties. I mean, for example, this Dutch influencer, she would go on to Tucker Carlson in the US and talk about riots in Sweden. So, I mean, it was very interesting also to see how they would construct certain imaginaries about other countries, and how other countries would often be positioned as either, say, like a far-right utopia, like Sweden. So Sweden would often be positioned as this utopian imaginary for what the far right idealized as its society, and yet Sweden was also a country that was seen in very dystopic terms as overrun by migrants and left-wing progressives, right? So it was very interesting to see then how they would react to certain national news stories as well as transnational ones, and how they would tend to view the far right in as a type of global community in that sense. And the second question related is, how do they respond to what their audience want in terms of content? I think that's a great question. Part of it is how they maintain that relevancy in terms of perhaps tapping into different types of topics to see if that gains traction for their followers or perhaps gains new followers. Sometimes they will sort of solicit crowdsourced suggestions on one platform for another. So I remember, for example, one influencer had asked her followers on Twitter, what should be the topic for my next YouTube video? And so she was crowdsourcing those suggestions and then made a YouTube video based on those top suggestions. But one aspect that I really like to emphasize from this book is, for many of these influencers, I actually argue that they're involving their audience in their content creation in ways that is very different from before. So they will use things like the poll function on Instagram stories, trying to solicit engagement or feedback. They'll do Q&As on YouTube or on Instagram where their followers can write and ask questions that they will answer. So they will even ask for input when they're, say, writing books and say, like, what would you like to see included in this? And so I argue that this is quite a different phenomenon that we are witnessing today when it comes to the far right and what is a much more mainstream audience in terms of how they're actually involving their followers in their content creation process and sort of engaging them in a way that seems to be quite interactive. And so I use this concept called networked intimacy in the book to show how audiences feel like they can intimately know and feel engaged with the influencers, which I would say is quite different from perhaps the far right of the past, where a lot of these things was happening when we're writing books, but it was a lot more invisible, a lot more closed off than what we see today.
We have a few minutes left. So let me ask you a little bit about, in the next couple of minutes, about the implications that you think this research on these women has for policymakers, for example, or for others who are interested in, I don't know, either containing the far right or how the message spreads, or all these questions about should we platform, should we not, should we not platform? How do you think your research responds to these questions?
So in the last chapter of the book, or the penultimate chapter rather, I write about various strategies to counter the far right. And I focus on both online and offline aspects. Now with the online aspects, this is a lot more relevant to, say, maybe tech companies who are concerned about this content on their platforms and perhaps want to restrict the spread of harmful or problematic content that these women produce. As I mentioned earlier, though, these women are very good at not violating a lot of the rules of these tech company platforms. And so that is also an issue too, because I have been in conversation with YouTube and with Instagram, pointing out to them, actually, this is harmful. This is potentially violated. So there is definitely a shift in terms of, I think, this understanding about what these women are publishing on these platforms. And there's also very real gender blind spots as well. So, for instance, there's this one influencer I studied whose husband has been banned from almost every platform off the face of this earth. But she has continued to remain on the platforms because she promotes her messaging in very subtle, very soft framings. But she is prohibited from showing photos of her husband's face on Instagram. So she uses an Austrian flag emoji to cover up his face. But she will post the exact same photo on her Telegram account, for example, undoctored, unfiltered, just as is. And I think this is a prime example of what is really much a gender blind spot, because like her husband, who was a leader of a movement within Europe, She believes in the same ideas, in the same ideology as him. She's a member of the same organization that has been banned from France, for example. She has faced legal prosecution for her activism, and she's been denied entry to countries' borders like the UK. And yet she's still profiting. Actually, I didn't mention this in the talk, but she's literally monetizing off of her presence on these platforms. She continues to get sponsors, she gets advertising revenue. And so I point out to companies there's a major gender blind spot when it comes then to how they see the problem and how that should be redressed. And then, of course, in a more offline manner, obviously a lot of government and similar policy interventions. It's definitely a lot more complicated in terms of dealing with people physically, face to face. Certainly, how our political leaders talk about gender matters quite a lot in terms of influencing young people. I mean, almost all the influencers I studied when they began their political activism, they described how they liked figures like Trump, because they thought that his version of masculinity was something that they sought out. And so certainly how political leaders talk about gender matters a great deal in terms of influencing what becomes acceptable for certain norms and values. And then, of course, things like education and schooling matter a great deal as well. I think a paradox for these influencers is that they are vehemently anti-feminist, or at least they claim to be so, and yet they have very much profited from the gains of feminism. They've gone to university, they write books and magazine articles, they own bank accounts where they receive their monetization, they own property, they vote. All of these aspects that have been the direct gains of women rights and feminist movements, right? And so a lot of the education approaches then take into account what does feminism and women's rights actually mean in terms of society today, and sort of not taking for granted the gains of those movements for society as it is now. So I mean, there's probably so much to unpack when it comes to various ways to counter the far right, and I detail a lot of that within a chapter within the book. But those are just some of the highlights in terms of sort of then understanding how we can find different avenues. There's no one size fits all approach, right? It's a lot of using these different approaches in combination that I think is the most effective.
I'm sure everyone will agree with me that this is indeed really interesting. And I mean, at least I have learned a lot, and I look forward to finishing the book as well. We have run out of time, but I want to ask you one last quick question before we wrap up, which is this is amazing. What's next in your research?
So, I mean, I am inspired by looking at ways that these women were sort of circumventing a lot of the moderation efforts of tech companies. I'm now really focused on the policy side, like what are tech companies actually doing in response to far-right activity on their platforms, which for them is, in short, very complicated and very difficult to pinpoint. So that's what I'm working on now. I'm also increasingly interested in looking at the world of masculinist influencers, now that I have looked at the women and sort of seen then how their constructions of masculinity contribute to things like extreme misogyny and male supremacy. So kind of both sort of the policy side, but also sort of the culture side as well.
Fantastic. Eviane Leidig, thank you so much for joining us today. This was really fascinating. And I hope that everybody looks forward to reading the book and all the other research books, etc., that come after. I'm really keen on the male influencers now and see how they compare. So thanks a million for joining ASEN. And we'll see you, everyone else, at the next webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Recording